A lot of people have a lot of insults to be flinging at the summon spells here in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, because they're numerically not as good as some of the other spells. So a lot of people would compare them to the other things you could be doing with their spell slots, and come to the conclusion that they are not that useful. However, I personally believe that is a skill issue, and you should just get good. However, that is a lot of effort, and it isn't necessarily rewarded in the most straightforward way, because a lot of summon spells are rewarded in that utility factor. So if you're not that interested in that utility factor, or you don't want to have to be constantly tracking this massive list of things, the normal spells will get you to exactly where you need to go just fine. But there are a few little tricks in the summon spells that I'll highlight here that will be helpful for any variety of player. But before we get into that, I can now have this graph pop up on screen, and you now know what to do. I am ironic. Anyway, closing that out. So, let's get into this by starting to talk about what a summon spell actually does. Let me first define what I mean by a summon spell. So all the summon spells are usually the spells with summon in the name, and animate dead. That one doesn't follow the normal templating. But all the ones that usually have summon in the name, and then have the mechanics of, you summon some creature with some kind of trait who has a level of way lower than yours, and then they hide in like this. That is how all of the summon spells broadly work, and I'm going to be going over what summon spells are the best to be using, what creatures you should be looking for in what is a good summon, and then also a little way to get it to work a little bit better in Foundry. So, now, let's get started. So, a lot of the power of these summon spells is actually in that you have a bunch of versatility. If you are not going to use the summon spells for the versatility, and you're going to go in with, I'm just going to summon this one creature and win the game, you're probably not using them to their fullest potential, and you'd probably be better off prepping a different spell slot in their place, unless you have a very, very strong plan, and there is one summon that I think is like that, but we'll get to that eventually. So, and I think that this whole animate dead spell is really the one that shows this the best, because you have something like Skeleton Guard, which has a laundry list of immunities. Death effects, disease, mental, paralyzed, poison, unconscious, just all right there, all immune. So if you know you have an enemy that relies on death effect, disease, mental, paralyzed, poison, unconscious, you can know that this will do very well to them. Especially if they have to apply that via cold, electricity, fire, piercing, which are also resistances. Oh, and also slashing. It didn't fit all on one line because that's just how good it is. But you know, if your opponent then has something like bludgeoning damage, you just simply don't summon a Skeleton Guard and you summon something like a Crawling Hand. So your spell slot isn't useless in that scenario, and Crawling Hand can easily apply Grab to things, which then has them get grabbed, and they have a very hard time casting spells. So if they have a spellcaster, then Crawling Hand is incredible. So you then have this spell slot that can shut down 2 different types of encounters. And you can just prepare at the start of the day and be completely happy with however you end up actually spending it. So that is fundamentally what makes the summoning spells so powerful. Another little trick with these summoning spells, just a little extra trick, is nowhere in them does it actually care about your spell DC. It just summons a creature of that level. So, if you're something like a War Priest that naturally has a much lower cast anyway, you can then further dump Wiz. And if you want to have spell slots turn to damage, you can then use them to summon things that are hard to kill and will do a bunch of damage. So, another good idea to be spending actions on War Priest. You can then use this to summon things that are very, very strong to specific types of encounters, and then have the knowledge of what type of encounter you're in to then summon the creature at the end. And this is where I get into the issue of summoning spells, where there are a lot of creatures in this game. You can keep on scrolling, because there are a lot of creatures in this game. And you will need to have a working knowledge over everything that you could potentially summon. Which is a lot to ask of somebody. And if your GM is one of those people that has a no phone policy at the table, you're not going to be able to use summon spells to their fullest potential, because you're going to need to re-look up these stat blocks, because there's no way you're memorizing all of them. There's just no shot that you're doing it. And the GM is not going to want to have constantly look this up for you, so if your GM is at a no phones at the table rule, they kind of soft ban summoning spells along with that, which is sucky, but how it goes. So, now I think that it's time to talk about what are the best summoning characters. And I already mentioned War Priest as a good option, but what are the things that you should look for in a summoning character, in a Necromancer character? And I think the number one thing you should look for is a character that is fine with using their third action sustaining a summon spell. And that usually means a caster that's going to be spending a 2-action cantrip and then fine with moving an undead as their third action. So that means you're not really going to want to do it on something like a bard, because a bard already wants to use a lot of their composition cantrips for their third action. They're going to want to demoralize as their third action. They're going to want to make a short bow strike as their third action. So bard already has a lot of good third action options. But if you're a caster like a sorcerer only has demoralize out of those actions to fill up their final slot. So they're completely fine with just sustaining. And you get a lot of things like that, where you have casters that don't really have this super strong third actions. And the wisdom casters of Druid Cleric specifically, the wisdom actions, if you don't have Battle Medicine or you don't want a Battle Medicine that round, aren't very good because their recall knowledge is a bit more specific in the nature and religion, what those things cover. So they are very fine with just like having an undead be there and walk forward. Mind you, for Cleric, it competes with their shield cantrip, but for Druid, they'd need to be wearing a shield if they want to raise a shield. So, Druids actually are, funnily enough, pretty good summoners in terms of who would utilize these the best. And now, I think it's time for me to move on to how they function at the higher levels of play, because if you notice in their height-ends, they fall off pretty hard in terms of the actual level they get, and there is a good reason for that. And that is, of course, there are some creatures that can also cast spells. So, in order for me to show you how you can further break these summoning spells and use those, let's jump over to Summon Fae. And so, Summon Fae has a really funny creature in it called a Unicorn. And if you look at the Unicorn, it has this funny little ability down here. Third level heals times 2. So you can use a 4th level slot, because that's what you need in order to summon a level 3 creature. So you summon 4th level slot to get your Unicorn out on the board. And then your Unicorn, when it's summoned, has 2 actions and can use a third level heal for 2 actions to heal somebody for a lot. And then if the GM does not deal with this Unicorn immediately, it's going to do it again. That's really disgustingly strong, because this Unicorn is now soaking a ton of damage, and it's making enemies really want to go after it, where it can then start running around and effectively just being another thing to try and soak damage. While it's significantly lower level than the party, a lot of creatures, because they're not supposed to be on the player's side, have these abilities that let them get spells ridiculously early compared to when player characters would get access to them, and that is really what starts to push summon spells forward. And that is exactly why spells like Summon Fiend are all the way down here at 5th level spells. So Summon Fiend is a 5th level spell because all Fiends have this funny little line of text where, even like these level 1 Fiends, they all have Divine Innate spells where they all have like 4th level spells that they can cast innately. So they need to have Summon Fiend at 5th level so that you couldn't just turn a level 1 spell slot into Better Wish. That's why Summon Fiend is such a high level spell. Because you have all these creatures that can then use these spells, use these special abilities, to then get this ridiculous amount of value. Yeah, their numbers are lower, but the amount of utility you get from a spell slot that can break down to a bunch of other spells is literally the thing that is putting Wish on the board as a 3-action activity in Pathfinder 2nd. You can make a lesser version of Wish from any summon spell, if you know the spell list of all the creatures that you're summoning. That is a big knowledge check, and a big amount of power you get from it. So that's why they made it so that they do not scale well in combat. Because if they did scale well in combat, this knowledge check would be the thing that casters would be doing, and it would make the game completely inaccessible to anybody that doesn't want to put in this amount of time. So it is actually a good thing that summon spells are not balanced, that way they'd be good in combat just through raw numbers. Because otherwise, what I'm describing here would completely shatter the game in half. Because you just signature spell one of your Fae, summon Fae, and you could then summon a bunch of Fae creatures that all have different innate spell lists, and then really, really start to put pressure on the game systems in ways that would force Paizo to then make every creature uncommon that has innate spellcasting, which would make these spells a lot less versatile and a lot less fun, but a lot more beginner accessible. But that would have every creature start to feel like just a pile of numbers, which is very against the spirit of summon spells in this game. So that's why they are the way they are, and that's why a lot of people are disappointed in them, because their numbers needed to be lower in order to allow for this type of utility to happen. And there are some other things that you would want to avoid on your summon creatures, and those are the things along the lines of reactions. Powerful reactions are things that you usually want to avoid on these things, because the minion trait that all summon creatures have has a thing where they cannot use reactions inside of it. So if I look here for reactions, doesn't have reactions, and can't act when it's not your turn. I'm going to move my webcam because, again, Archives of Nethys puts information everywhere, so I need to move my webcam in order to have everything properly be viewed. So that's one of the issues that you want. So you want creatures that don't have budget or encounter creature power budget put into these 3-action activities, put into these reactions. You want to find things with very powerful 2-action things to do. So that's stuff like Giant Skunk for early game. Because things like Giant Skunk have the Blinding Musk, which has you get a 15-foot cone that makes people sicken 3, and also on a crit fail, blind them for a round. So that's very powerful. You get the Skunk against things with low fort saves, and you'd want to find things with powerful 2-action abilities like these, or innate spellcasting. So due to all the stuff that I've mentioned, my favorite summon spells are actually Animate Dead and Summon Construct, because they have very nice resistances / immunities. Moving webcams so you can read the names of the spells as I'm talking about them. So Constructs have a crap ton of immunities because the Construct trait itself does so much. So having Summon Construct means that if a creature relies on any of that stuff up there, it really, really starts to punish them. And there are many that have something like Hardness, so if they rely on a bunch of small hits or persistent damage, you then have utility there. And there are a lot of constructs that will do slightly different things, so good pick. And Animate Dead for basically the same reasons, because Undead is a creature type with a ton of variety in it. So learning those, you can actually summon them as like beaters and different utility creatures, and that's good. And my next 3 favorites are Summon Fae, Summon Fiend, and Summon Celestial. Simply because these are the 3 categories of creatures that have the highest density of spellcasters. And as I said before, spellcasting creatures are very, very good. Anyway, now actually on to Foundry. For a while. So, here's my actual Foundry setup. I have not updated V11 yet, so I'm not going to be using the actual module that I'm going to say, because it's currently handled by the animations module J2BA. But I'm going to open up my Cleric's sheet and move my camera, not the screen, my camera to the top left, and I'm going to go cast Animate Dead. So it then immediately pops up the Summon Anything box, where I can then pick what level -1 creature I'm going to summon. So if I choose to summon Crawling Hand, I can click OK, and it'll ask me where I want to place it down. And I'll place it down there. Because I am the GM, it then sends a request to GM to say, hey, your player's trying to summon a creature, do you allow it? And I say, sure. And then animation begins to play. The actual summoner has a little flash, and there's your Crawling Hand. And then it's on the board, and it would actually give the player ownership of the creature, so that way they can control it on their turn. And that's really, really clean. And the module that does that in the current version of Foundry is known as Foundry Summons. And I would highly recommend doing this module if you are GMing or planning to use summon spells yourself. So with that, that's the end of the video. Make sure to subscribe, because at 1,000 subscribers I can join the Paizo Partner Program and get early access to classes so I can make wrestler builds earlier. Anyway, I'm not an addict, you're the one with the problem. So, go do the thing, please. I want to get to 1,000 to get into the program. Please.